It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
We've got a very exciting show coming up. I have to tell you, a month ago, we spoke with legendary ad guru Bill Hilsman about political advertising. As you may recall, it was Mr. Hilsman's firm that conceived the MasterCard parody ad for Ralph's presidential run in 2000. They used the catchphrase "priceless," and that became the most memorable ad of the entire campaign. It was such a dead-on parody that MasterCard, in their corporate arrogance, sued the Nader campaign, which forced the news media to play it over and over again free of charge. The campaign got a lot of bang for their buck on that day. Today, Mr. Hilsman is back to help us deconstruct some of the ads the Democrats are running in support of Joe Biden, and we may throw a Trump ad in there too. At this moment, Biden has built a double-digit lead in national polls, but it's still very early, and the pandemic makes it more difficult than ever to get a clear message out. When you can't have rallies that get covered in the news media, television ads have to carry an even heavier load. So that's what we're going to do in the first part of the show. We're going to list some recent political ads, probably seen some of them already on television. Which ones are good? Which ones should they put on the shelf? Trump is a master at media manipulation. How does Biden set himself apart? Especially since, as Bill told us last month, Biden's, quote, just not a very dynamic candidate, unquote. So this should be fun. In the second half of the program, we're going to talk about Facebook. Facebook's put out a lot of fake news, and when you see a post on Facebook, it's hard to tell if it came from a Russian bot, Donald Trump's campaign, or your uncle. But it seems like we have the right to know. Our second guest, Robert Feldman, certainly thinks so. He's particularly worried about Facebook's policy on anonymity because of how it affects children. With the prevalence of cyberbullying, bullies can hide behind fake profiles. And along with that, Facebook's lack of privacy protection means that a photo of a child can be reposted on Facebook 1 million times without their consent. We talked to Mr. Feldman about this last time he was on the show, but we want to continue that discussion today, considering how school has gone online and looks like it will continue to be for most children in the fall. These questions of internet privacy and protection are becoming increasingly important. In between, we'll take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have some time left over, we'll try to answer some listener questions. But first, let's break down some 2020 political ads. David?
Bill Hilsman is back. He's a writer and an expert on independent voters. He's the founder and CEO of Northwoods Advertising in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He ran award-winning political advertising campaigns for Senator Paul Wellstone, Governor Jesse Ventura, and our very own Ralph Nader's presidential campaign. Northwoods Advertising has won numerous awards for creativity in advertising, including an Emmy and multiple Polly Awards. Mr. Hilsman authored the book, Run the Other Way, Fixing the Two-Party System, One Campaign at a Time. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bill Hilsman.
Thanks, David.
Welcome indeed, Bill. This is going to be interesting, listeners, because you're going to get a granular review of some of these ads that you're seeing on television. But I'd like to point out that, in my experience, the Democrats use about 2 arrows for every 12 they have in their quiver against the worst Republican Party in history. And I don't think their ads have emphasized corruption of the Trump administration, which is setting all-time records day after day with contracts and favoritism and crony capitalism and waivers from laws, you name it. And I don't think they've focused on something they focused on 3-4 years ago, which is, what about this savage sexual predator and his abuse of women, and bragging about it and never apologizing and calling his accusers all liars as they sue in court and provide credible evidence of what he did to them. So with that background, Bill, you've commented that the Democrats' lead may not be as persuasive because it's based on a national poll rather than the swing states poll. Can you elaborate that?
Sure. All this unguarded optimism about Biden being able to beat Trump in the fall is based upon these national poll numbers that show these wide leads. But James Holman, in particular, of the Washington Post, did a really good article on this a day or so ago, where when you start to break down these national poll numbers into more likely voters and different types of voter cohorts, you find out that the lead is not that big at all. And in fact, it doesn't really matter what the lead is on a national scale, because as we saw in the last election, whoever wins the most national votes, the popular vote, doesn't necessarily win the presidency. So what people should be paying attention to, Democrats in particular, are polls in particular swing states that are going to decide the electoral college margin and who becomes the next president.
And you don't think they're doing that, or you think it's a little too early and they're going to do it, say, right after Labor Day?
I think they may be doing it, but the overall impression that people are getting are based on these national polls. So I feel like it's 2016 all over again, because a lot of Democrats are sitting there thinking, we got this thing in the bag, and all this positive press that they hear about how far behind Trump is in national polling. And it's just not factual. I mean, it's not relevant to what's really going to happen in the election.
Bill, tell us who these advertising agencies for the Democrats are. Who are these consultants? You know, they sort of crave anonymity, but they are tremendously influential and sometimes not very smart at all. They have counseled the Democrats into one defeat after another at the national, state, and local level against this terrible Republican Party. Who are these agencies?
Mostly they're the same Democratic political consultants that have been working for generations on Democratic races. In a presidential year, if you do not have a single candidate, for instance, you don't have an incumbent or the primary hasn't been settled yet, you have a number of these different firms working for different candidates in the primary. What happens once the party's settled on a candidate is that presidential campaign has to figure out a way to keep all of these consultants employed. So they all basically get a piece of the action post-primary in terms of trying to be a part of the overall national communications effort for, in this case, Joe Biden. That can lead to a lot of problems, and it definitely leads to a lot of wasted money in terms of conflicting advice, conflicting opinions, and just money going in pockets of people that aren't really doing anything except getting paid to be a part of the process.
Well, they get a 15% cut of all television ads, so they want more of the money of the candidates spent on TV than on the ground get out the vote. That's always been a bias. But who are some of these groups? Is one of them the Grunwald consulting firm that worked with Hillary Clinton and actually was working with Elizabeth Warren's first Senate race? Who are the names?
You could go on Google and basically search Democratic pollsters, Democratic media consultants, Democratic general strategic consultants, and you're going to come up with a bunch of firms, almost all based in Washington, D.C. I don't know if Mandy's firm is actually involved in Biden's campaign or not. I suspect she's doing something for the party as part of the presidential race. Stan Greenberg's firm is another one. Greer Margolis is another one. I don't know. I'd have to go Google myself to remind myself of who all these firms are.
Yeah. Okay, I got to tell you a conversation I had with Elizabeth Moynihan, who was so disgusted with the campaign consultants for the Democratic Party that she threw them out and became Daniel Patrick Moynihan's manager for repeated re-election to the U.S. Senate from the state of New York. And she thought these consultants were in the category of who needs enemies when you got friends like these? What's your overview of their competence here, given their record of losing elections?
Well, they're very good at making excuses. I mean, they've become very skilled professionals in that regard. In the last election, most of the Democratic pollsters blamed their failings on, quote, magical thinking, which I've always believed is a good way to describe political polling. Ever since Al Gore's race, they've become very, very good at a way why they lose elections that should be absolute ironclad victories. So there's a great deal of incompetence on the Democratic side. I think it's a little bit more worrisome what's taken place recently on the Republican side.
Yeah, tell us.
Where Donald Trump replaced Brad Parscale. Basically, he was his media consultant in the 2016 race. And Democrats were in decent shape as long as Brad was in charge of the overall campaign, because he's not a political person. he doesn't really understand political strategy. Facebook held his hand through the entire 2016 campaign, and that's how Donald Trump won. It was basically Facebook's help with a digital ad campaign with Brad Parscale that won the election. Remember, none of the Trump people thought they were actually going to win, including Brad. And Brad's basically a guy who understands metrics like impressions, which are digital measurements that Facebook tries to tell all its advertisers is important. In the grand scheme of things, it's a vapor measurement. You don't really know what it means. It's just something that Facebook tells you is important, so you should feel good about it, and you should try to get as many of them as possible. But he's been replaced, and he's been replaced by a guy, Bill Stepien, I think his name, who actually counts votes, who comes from a field organization background, and who is going to be looking at the swing states with a very close eye and trying to count actual votes. That's what you want in a campaign manager, and that's going to make it a lot difficult for Democrats to win in the key swing states this time.
And what do you think the principal vulnerabilities of Trump are in terms of the way the Democrats could shape their ads before we get to specific ads?
Well, I think the vulnerabilities of the campaign are legion. Let's look at what the Trump campaign is really trying to do. Another switch that was made by the Trump campaign was elevating Jay Miller. Jason Miller is a strategist that comes from the Swift school of Republican attacks. He and the type of people that worked against John Kerry in Kerry's presidential election year, they will stop at nothing. There is no bottom to how low they will go. And the Trump campaign itself, there is no bottom to how low they will go. So I think the Democrats have to be ready for possibly the types of campaign tactics that we've never seen before in this country, in terms of lying, in terms of misinformation, disinformation, and as we saw over the weekend, even to the point of not accepting the results of the election. So we're entering into a very dangerous time, and Democrats have to realize not only are they going to have to win in swing states, they're going to have to win by fairly large margins if they're going to be able to avoid Trump saying he's just not going to abide by the results of the election.
Do you think they're up to it before we get to the ads? I mean, they just don't seem to be tough enough. As we've said on this program several times, Kevin Phillips, the former Republican strategist and author, once described the difference between the Republicans and Democrats this way. He said the Republicans go for the jugular and the Democrats go for the capillaries. Are they up to it? Do they have the people in charge who really know how to work the situation in Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan?
I think it's almost less of do they have the right people in place to do this as do they know the right people to talk to? So to answer your question briefly, I don't know that Democrats are tough enough and they do have the right people. I do know that the Democrats don't have a very good understanding of the swing voters that they're going to have to talk to in these swing states in order to move the votes that they're going to need to move. For instance, all Trump really needs to do to get reelected is to concentrate on independent voters, self-identified independent voters in swing states, and suburban voters in swing states. And if you think about the mentality of swing voters in many of these swing states, especially suburban voters, it comes down to a sense of who can do a good job on the economy and who can do a good job in terms of keeping us safe. And the Trump campaign has figured that out, and you've seen it in their most recent advertising. So the only route to re-election for Trump right now is this. One, blame the coronavirus response on anybody and everybody but the federal government. So he's blaming China, he's going to blame the governors, he's going to blame mayors, he's going to blame whoever he can for all of this. And then the recent political unrest over race is also playing into this as far as suburban voters go. And the Democrats have kind of given the Trump campaign an opening with their calls to defund the police in many of these areas. So what's happening in the minds, I believe, of suburban voters is they're looking at this from the standpoint of, they're pretty bad, but what's going on in this city that I'm living by? You know, there's crimes up, the police are down, the police are not responding, the police are now filing disability claims, so they're not showing up for work. And all this stuff makes me scared. And you know what? The economy was doing pretty good before this coronavirus thing. So if the Trump campaign can get these voters to think about anything but coronavirus, if they can switch to the safety of people in the cities and the lack of police protection, and you've seen steps that he's tried to do to take action on this in Portland, possibly in Chicago, other places he's sending in federal forces that are uninvited. This is a campaign move. This is not necessarily a safety move. This is a campaign move.
But, you know, it seems to be boomeranging. Mayors, governors, no matter what party they're attached to, they don't like the feds coming in, especially in the South, you know, states' rights. It's boomeranging in Oregon. But anyway, let's get into the specific ads. Steve, you want to take up this?
Yeah. We're going to start with a Biden ad. This is a short one. It's about 15 seconds, and it's called That's a President.
This job is about protecting Americans, not tear gassing them for a photo op. It takes strength, courage, compassion, resilience. That's a president.
So what do you think of that one, Bill?
I thought there was something interesting about it. In the grand scheme of things, it's the usual type of political ad. But what was interesting to me about this particular 15-second ad was that it was kind of cut and used music like it was a military recruitment ad. If you see ads for the armed forces mostly on sports shows, a lot of the ads are similar in tone and style to this particular ad. The problem with the ad, which is called That's the President, is that it falls flat in its logic. I mean, Donald Trump is the president. We all know that. Joe Biden isn't president. He was a vice president. Everybody knows that. And what the ad does, it attempts to use photos of the vice president in presidential style positions, and it doesn't obviate the obvious. I mean, most voters' impressions of the current Joe Biden, as opposed to the Biden that's shown in this particular commercial, is that he's a shaky candidate that's holed up in the basement someplace. So I don't think that this is really a good ad in that it tries too hard to make Biden into something that everybody doesn't believe he is at this point. We talked about this last time. Like it or not, Trump is a dynamic candidate. Biden is not. And an ad like this just doesn't change that.
Okay, very good. Very interesting. This next one is called 4 Hours. This one is a minute long.
He took the train 4 hours every day so he could have breakfast with his boys in the morning and tuck them in at night. People in Washington didn't get why Joe Biden would travel all that way. But in neighborhoods all over this country, there's no distance parents won't go for their kids. Never underestimate the power of family or the sacrifices people will make for their children. That love, that hope, that determination, that's what fuels the American dream. It's why you stay up paying bills, sign up for that extra shift, worry about schools and healthcare. When Joe Biden traveled those 4 hours, he wasn't just going home for his kids. He was going to work for them too, just like he will for yours.
All right, that one's called 4 Hours. What about that one, Bill?
It's a pretty long ad. I'd be surprised if it's appearing on air very much on TV because of its length. I think it's probably being used more as a digital ad. I didn't think there was anything really remarkable about the ad. It's basically portraying Biden as a family man and as a parent, and it's aimed at working families. I think it's potentially effective depending on where they're using it. It's softer, it's a little more emotional. again, I think it could be useful if it's used in the right places in certain swing states.
And a lot of references to working people.
Yes. A lot of references to working people, as is said that I think you're going to, which is called This Is How. And if you play that one, I can talk about the contrast between these two ads a little bit.
Before you do that, Bill, comment on sound. Sometimes the music is not just in the background, it's too loud. You're known not to use loud music in your ads. You let visuals and the words that are used dominate the ad. Don't you think there's too much music?
It's difficult to judge how the music is going to play in the final analysis. But technically, when you're mixing these things, it depends a lot on what studio you're using. It depends on what you're doing the playback on. The problem these days is it's not like the old days where everybody had a TV that was made by one of 4 manufacturers. The playback of an ad may be taking place on a phone. It might be taking place on a computer. It might be taking place on a monitor. It might be taking place on a big screen TV. So it's very difficult to know how the final mix is going to come across to the consumer. And the consumer has a great deal of control over how the sound comes coming out of the speakers. So at least in the audio that we just heard, you're right, the music was overpowering. Whether that's the case for everybody that hears this, I don't know. But you're absolutely correct when you say TV is predominantly a visual medium. The visuals have to tell the story. The words have to support the visual story. And if it doesn't do that, it's a failure.
Okay, good.
Anything that detracts from that is also a failure.
All right, now let's move to the ad that Bill just referred to. This one is called This Is How. It's another minute-long ad.
Every day that Donald Trump fails to get this virus under control is another day our economy falls further and further behind. We not only need to turn things around, we need to rebuild this economy better than it was before. It's why Joe Biden is running for president, to help working families, not the wealthy or big corporations. The plan is simple. If you spend taxpayer dollars, you should buy American products and support American jobs. Joe Biden has a plan to bring small businesses and manufacturing back. That's because Joe Biden believes the future should be made in America by all of America. He'll bring back critical supply chains and create millions of jobs. He'll lower healthcare costs, close tax loopholes for corporations, and make historic investments in our schools. This is a plan for working families. This is Joe Biden's plan for the future. And this is how we will build a better America.
All right, what about that one, Bill?
Well, in contrast to the previous ad that we were discussing, this is less of an emotional appeal, and it's basically all promises. It's the same type of what I would call political claptrap that viewers have built up defenses against for decades. What it really is a litany of promises. It's got no details other than, quote, Joe Biden has a plan, end quote. The visuals also, it's an attempt to co-opt the Buy American trope that the Republicans have used very well for very long and claim that for Biden's campaign. But Trump has actual action taken in that regard. I mean, he hasn't been strong on very many things, but he does have a record that Joe Biden doesn't really have on this. So I'm not quite sure where they were going with this. I just think this is the type of commercial that Americans have learned to ignore, as opposed to the previous ad, which at least had some sense of emotion to it, as opposed to just a litany of promises.
Bill, how much do people respond to policy? Because it seems like your average voter, at least in my experience, they're always assessing character and personality, kind of ignoring the fact that these are very filtered personalities that are being presented to them.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly true in a presidential race, too. But Biden's already won on that, or he should be able to win on that. So if that's the case, why are you doing ads like this? If what you say is true, if policy matters far less in this than a contrast of character, then if I were the Biden campaign, I'd be concentrating on contrast of character.
But do you think that's true?
Yeah, I do think it's true, particularly in presidential races, and particularly in race like this, where it's not like there's clear lines of demarcation between the candidates. There are. It's not like, say, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. This is a big contrast in terms of the people that were choosing to run the country for the next 4 years. And I think the more the Democrats can concentrate on that, the better. I don't know why you would do an ad that's similar to every other type of political ad that we've seen for decades and that people know are just political claptrap, basically.
Okay, thanks, Bill. This next one is another 1 minute long ad. It's called Tough.
I'm thinking of all of you today. I know the rise in case numbers is causing fear and apprehension. People are frightened, and they're especially worried about their parents, their grandparents, their loved ones who are most at risk. You know, this virus is tough, but we can stop the spread. But it's up to all of us to do it. We have to step up and do both the simple things and the hard things to keep our families and our neighbors safe. Wear a mask, wash your hands, stay home if you can, and socially distance when you go out. I want every single American to know, if you're sick, if you're struggling, if you're worried about how you're going to get through the day, I will not abandon you. We're all in this together. We'll fight this together. And together, we'll emerge from this stronger than we were before we began. I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
All right, what about that?
I thought it was kind of simple-minded. I mean, it's basically what I call a checkers ad. You know, you're red and I'm black and I'm going to jump you. You say, I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm going to say, yeah, let's all wear a mask. I didn't think it was particularly moving the ball forward, especially since, you know, Biden says that he's with us, but even in this particular ad, the visuals are basically Biden in his basement. Any of the more recent footage, it was obvious was either green screened or shot with Biden in his basement. So I think the campaign has to figure out ways to make Biden look a little bit more dynamic. The spot itself just says, I'm with you. I know everything's tough out there right now. Default, this guy says, don't do any of this stuff. I say, do it. Again, I don't know really how effective an ad that is.
That's our Biden ads. This next one is a Trump ad, and it kind of speaks to what you were talking about before, about the suburbs. I'll just tell you the visual on this. This is a 30-second ad. It's an elderly woman, looks like in the suburbs, watching television. And as the ad goes on, you see a shadowy figure in the background with a crowbar attempting to break into the house.
Seattle's pledged to defund its police department by 50%, even including a proposal to remove 911 dispatchers from police control.
Joe Biden said he's absolutely on board with defunding the police. Listen closely.
Yes, absolutely.
Hello, you've reached 911. I'm sorry that there is no one here to answer your emergency call, but leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.
Crime will rise significantly.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Yeah, so with that visual in mind, that was the copy.
This is like a college student's version of a political ad with slightly better done audio. But it does showcase the strategy. I mean, there's an outright lie in there in terms of Biden calling to defund the police, which we found out over the weekend is definitely not true. But it shows the strategy. I mean, the strategy is very obvious. If you're a senior, a group that we know absolutely is going to vote, and you feel threatened by civic unrest and everything that's going on in the cities, well, Donald Trump's here to save you. It's the strategy, all encapsulated in one ad, not a very particularly well done ad, but it puts it all out there pretty clearly.
Let me just ask you a few quick questions, Bill.
Sure.
One is, how would you do an ad that addresses the outright lies that are going to fill the airways by the Trumpsters against Biden?
I think that gets difficult to do. I mean, a person who, I think you have to find a credible spokesperson to do that, who people would actually believe. And when you're looking at swing voters, when you're looking at self-identified independents, it becomes really tough to find that voice of authority. It's not necessarily journalism, because of the way that Trump and the Republicans and people on the right have discredited institutions like America's Fourth Estate. I think this is actually one place where Barack Obama could make a difference. I don't think it's Obama's style. I don't know that the Biden campaign could get him to do it. But I think you need somebody that most people in America hold in high regard and still trust to be able to deliver that message. It could be somebody like an Oprah Winfrey even. People are putting a lot of emphasis on the messenger as opposed to the message these days. So it's almost more incumbent to have the right messenger in addition to the right message than just the message itself.
Question 2. 60% of women in a CNN poll in late November said that Trump should be not only impeached, but removed from office. That's November 2019. Would you have ads dealing with his cruel and vicious record against women?
I think so. I mean, they may be waiting to see who they choose for vice president before they go in that direction. But I think that's really insightful. I think that is important. The one group that could overcome entirely any sort of clawback Trump gets with independent voters, with some suburban voters, are women in general. I mean, particularly suburban women. Suburban women can really control this election if they want to.
The next question is corruption. Polls all over the world, including the U.S., when you ask people what they're most concerned about politicians, corruption is right up there again and again. This is a regime so corrupt, it's really staggering. I mean, it's almost so prevalent that it's been normalized, and the press sort of takes it for granted and doesn't go after enough with the word corruption. They do investigative pieces, but the word corruption isn't used much. Would you have an ad on corruption? And if so, how?
Well, I would definitely have an ad about corruption in the playbook. One of the funny parts about, or one of the ironic parts about the coronavirus crisis is that it's actually worked to help Trump a little bit in this way. It's really, really difficult to get anything in front of the American people right now that does not have to do with the coronavirus crisis or with political unrest. Those are the two things that almost everybody is thinking about these days. And if you're a practitioner in this realm, you can only do so much in terms of getting things into people's attention. So the Democrats could actually do a corruption ad. They could put $60 million in ad buys behind it. And I'm not sure it would penetrate the consciousness of the American people right now, simply because these two issues are just so far in the forefront of everything. It's almost impossible to break through with any other type of message.
Except, Bill, the corruption insinuated itself all through these trillions of dollars the government is handing out. It's handing out to political cronies, to favored big business, to corporate law firms they're tied to. I mean, receivers who should never get corporate welfare at a time of the COVID. So the corruption is very much tied in with the who gets the money, the distribution of money, who doesn't get it, lots of small business, lots of workers. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it's absolutely 100% correct. But I still maintain that there's not headspace for most people right now. Most people are not like people in Washington, D.C., or people who do politics full time. They have real problems living their daily lives right now. And it's just really difficult to get a message like that through to them. I would hope that later in the election, there'd be the ability to do that. And I would definitely, as you said before, they only use about 2 out of 12 arrows that are in the toolbox, in the quiver. And this is a good one, and it's an important one. It just has to be deployed at the right time, in the right places, and towards the right target audiences, towards the right potential voting groups. But right now, I just don't think it can break through on a large enough level until things change a little bit. And they may not change until very late in the election, or potentially not at all.
Of course, one thing that's very close to the heart of the American people is the fear of the COVID-19, and Trump's bungling, his dismissing it, his delays in February and March. scoffing at it, telling people to drink bleach, etc., has led to tens of thousands of preventable American deaths. And the Trump death clock at Times Square for about a month actually had a numbers count based on scientists who predicted what the cost of this delay by the federal government and not heading it off the way some countries like New Zealand, Taiwan, and other countries have done. So that's another opportunity. I mean, he's got to pay a price.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think when you can tie corruption to the coronavirus scandal and the response, that becomes very much a issue that can get traction. But remember, we've been talking about this through the whole segment. Trump is most vulnerable on the coronavirus response. His campaign strategy is to do anything that doesn't involve coronavirus or that shifts blame. So absolutely the Democrats should be hammering away on this, especially the bleach thing, especially all the errors that he's made, all the people who have died. We don't have very many political campaigns where death, actual death, is an issue. It is in this one. And there's nothing more important than that. The Trump campaign is trying its best to skate by it or to gloss over it. And the Democrats are guilty of malpractice if they aren't hammering that away every single day.
Steve, David, any input before we have to close?
Well, I wanted to ask you about advertising. Do we know for a fact that it actually works, or is it just a way to feather the nest of all these consultants, generally speaking?
Well, that's been a bone of contention for a long, long time. And the only thing, you cannot prove a causation between advertising and a particular action. You can prove a lot of high correlation. So people have studied this for decades, the commercial marketplace, and the reason why companies basically advertise and people advertise their services is because of that correlation. Do I know for sure that because a certain person saw a certain ad, that person voted for a certain candidate? No. But when you look at it over a broader group of people and a broader range of time, there seems to be a fairly high correlation between more levels of advertising, more effective advertising that people can play back to you, that can describe what they saw, and buying actions or voting actions.
You know, our next guest taught us not to trust TV advertising. There was a period in the late 60s and the 70s where I would assume most Americans didn't trust what they saw on television. Are audiences more trusting of TV ads now?
No. I mean, the problem if you're an ad maker is that there is no more sophisticated person in the world in terms of defenses against advertising than an American consumer. I mean, they're experts. They watch hours upon hours upon hours of this.
But we don't have an FTC or an FCC anymore saying this is a lie. Geritol is not telling the truth about this product. They used to do that. We don't hear the FTC or the FCC cracking down on false advertising. So after a while, haven't the American people been acclimated to assume that everything they see on TV must be the truth? The ads must be true?
No, I think it's the exact opposite. I think the default position for almost any American that's viewing a TV ad is that this is not true. This is somebody trying to sell me something. So you really have to be artful in the way that you go about trying to persuade somebody to do something to get around those defenses. I mean, whether it's true or whether it's false, the default position for most viewers in the United States is if this is advertising, somebody's trying to sell me a bill of goods.
I can just hear some of our listeners saying, what's all this emphasis on advertising? Just get some grassroots community, get out the vote movements underway. Get people registered. Get people to the polls and transportation. Get them to overcome the various obstacles of photo ID weeks before the election. Get them to learn how to do mail-in ballots. That's the way to get people out to vote and get them informed in the vote. What do you say about that? And is there any linkage to ads and getting people actually out to vote?
One of the very first political campaigns we did was for Paul Wellstone. Paul Wellstone was a college professor at a small college in Minnesota. He decided to run for United States Senate. His name identification was not very high in the state of Minnesota. Nobody really knew anything about a small town college professor in Minnesota. He was an organizer. He was convinced he was going to win this campaign on the basis of people getting out there, registering voters, making his case directly to voters. When he came to my office to ask us to do advertising for him, I explained to him, Paul, you could spend the next 30 days, 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, 20 hours a day if you want, going every place in the state, spending all that time trying to educate people, organize people, persuade people, and I can put one ad of 30 seconds on the 10 o'clock news tonight in Minneapolis, and I will reach more people more times than you will be able to do it in a month of organizing. Wellstone won in one of the biggest upsets in American political history, and it had to do with the ads. It was the ads that won that race and made Paul a U.S. Senator. There was no other route to victory for an organizer like him in that situation.
But he did go all over Minnesota in a bus, so he did get himself a lot of personal exposure to get people to like him.
He did, and the reason why the bus became such a symbol of the campaign was because we put it in the ads.
Oh, there's the connection.
People went looking for the bus.
Tell me, on our last program afterwards, did you get any feedback from any of the Democratic Party apparatchiks, either in Minnesota or elsewhere?
No, but that's been going on, for decades.
And how would people reach you and get more information about your views on political advertising for the 2020 election?
Probably the best way to contact me is through Northwoods Advertising website, northwoodsadvertising.com, or you can always email the firm at info@northwoods, plural, advertising.com.
Well, we're going to send this interview to the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee and the Green Party and the Libertarian Party and anyone else who's interested, so we can get a healthy discussion about all this, respect the voter, inform the voter, motivate the voter. Thank you very much, Bill Hilsman.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you for all the work you've done.
On that note, thank you very much, Bill. We'll see you shortly.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with political ad creator Bill Hilsman. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break. When we return, we're going to talk about a few of the many ways Facebook infringes on our rights. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 24, 2020. I'm Russell Mokhiber. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's administration has yet to make public the names of dozens of nursing homes whose experiences could shed light on whether the administration's controversial policy of sending hospital patients sick with COVID-19 into the vulnerable homes contributed to the state's staggering loss of life. That's according to a report from ProPublica. Under the policy, more than 6,000 COVID-19 patients were sent from hospitals to nursing homes across the state, a move that scared and enraged many families worried about their loved ones being exposed to the deadly virus. To date, at least 6,500 nursing home residents have died of the virus, more than 6% of the state's entire nursing home population. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Many of us talk about our distrust of Facebook. Many of us contemplate deleting our accounts. But if we did, how would we know what our peripheral friends who we never talked to are doing? How would we know what they were doing, or what meals they were having, or how their cats are doing? It's undeniable that many of us feel reliant on Facebook, and Facebook offshoots like Instagram and WhatsApp is the only option to delete our accounts, or can they be reformed? Can Facebook be held accountable for its choices? Our next guest is going to tell us more. David?
Robert Felmuth has had a long and distinguished career as a public advocate. As a graduate student in the late 60s, he became the original Nader's Raider, investigating the Federal Trade Commission. One of the first books he wrote while working with Ralph was The Politics of Land, a report on land use in California. He then went on to work as an attorney in Ralph's office, the Center for the Study of Responsive Law. In 1980, he founded the Center for Public Interest Law at the University of San Diego Law School, and also founded the Children's Advocacy Institute, an organization that specializes in reforming the child protection and foster care systems and improving outcomes for youth aging out of foster care. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Robert Felmuth.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Well, welcome back, Robert. We're going to deal with a truly arrogant corporation, Facebook. That CEO, Mr. Zuckerberg, has set all-time records for apologies before Congress and with the press. And he and his company have set an all-time record of arrogance, nullifying the meaning of those apologies. You wrote a letter months ago to Chairman Zuckerberg. Could you describe the letter and any response?
Well, the letter was an attempt to get Facebook to do its part to protect the First Amendment. Because the First Amendment isn't just the right to belch. It's not just the speaker. The audience has rights too. The audience needs to know, ideally, who is talking. If they don't know who is talking, they can't decide easily whether they want to listen or not, or watch or not. And they want to be able to judge the credibility and bias of the speaker. And we have that kind of, in a sense, in the political ads where we require identification in political ads of the top 3 contributors, blah, blah, blah. But in the email world and in the Facebook world, where mass communications are free, and anyone can engage in communication to 1 million people. And by the way, Facebook has over 1 billion subscribers. I don't think a lot of people don't know that. You can communicate, and the reader will never know who's talking, what's their bias. Are they from China? Are they from Russia? We don't know. And I think the First Amendment involves not just the right to speak, but the right to have a system where the listener can gauge the truth of the speaker and decide whether or not he or she wants to listen to it. This is not Big Brother. And I wrote the letter to Facebook because I said, all you have to do is require that anybody who posts on your vehicle identify who they are. That's all you have to do. You don't have to censor. Right now he's involved in a certain amount of censoring, which puts him in an untenable position. Well, gee, as Trump said X, well, there's a counter argument here, blah, blah, blah. That puts him in an untenable position to have to do that. It's much better if he just requires anybody who posts anything to say who they are. And then we can all, as under the First Amendment, as the audience, decide whether we want to listen and gauge the knowledge and the bias of the speaker. So we asked him to do that. He has the right to do it. He has the authority to do it. It's a private corporation. He can designate access conditions. He makes people pay. I mean, come on. He can do that. So we asked him to do it. We wrote not only the Zuckerberg, we wrote every member of his board of directors.
Now tell me this. So much of the slander, the nastiness, the lying, the libel, the cursing, all this could be reduced very significantly if we end anonymity.
Absolutely.
Anonymity is really the curse here. Now, is it true that they don't want to do that because it will reduce the number of usages of Facebook?
I don't know what their thinking is. That is a factor, I'm sure, because obviously if you have to identify who you are, you may not have as many users because they may not want to be identified. They don't want to identify themselves. And obviously you're going to cut someone off if they refuse to identify themselves, which Facebook should do if it's going to have such a rule. But it has to happen, Ralph. It's something that just has to happen because there's no other option here. There's no other way. You can't have Zuckerberg running around censoring and deciding whether or not there should be some corrective messaging. I may agree with some of his interventions, a couple of them I do agree with, but that's not the point. The point is the listener and the reader and the watcher should be the decider.
Well, let me be a devil's advocate here. There's an argument by civil rights advocates that anonymity in the old days protected people who contributed to the NAACP in the South. And so there's a challenge to make the donors be public against the NAACP. And if I remember correctly, the Supreme Court allowed the NAACP to protect the identity of its donors. Is there an exception to your request for full identification, no more anonymity?
No, not really. I'm not really concerned about that so much. I mean, the biggest argument I hear all the time is a variation of that, which is, what about whistleblowers? They have to remain anonymous in order to expose wrongdoing. My answer to that is every state should have a whistleblower law like California does. If you have a whistleblower law and someone defames you or attacks you or whatever because you blew the whistle on them, you have remedies, very, very strong remedies with attorney's fees built into the statute. So that's how you solve that problem. But you want to have a basic world, Ralph, where people who say something, even if it's critical or skeptical or an attack, say who they are. By the way, you have never done anything anonymously. And working for you, you always say, I am Ralph Nader, and here's what I say. And that's what everybody should do.
Well, look at the situation that newspapers are in. If you get a letter printed in a newspaper, you have to identify yourself. The newspapers, with very, very rare exceptions, will not print a letter from an anonymous writer. And if they did, the anonymous writer would have to identify herself or himself to the editor and ask for protection. However, on their internet feedback, on their website, they allow anonymous writers and anonymous accusers and anonymous opinionated people without identifying themselves. When I asked some newspapers why the double standard, they said, we want to increase traffic on our website. What's your comment?
Well, you've got a stronger issue than increasing traffic, and it's having quality traffic that does something, traffic that informs people, traffic that advances causes of any type. I mean, causes I disagree with, fine. Say who you are. You might change my mind. That's what we're all about. The liability issue, theoretically, I suppose someone could sue Facebook, except Facebook has all sorts of terms and conditions exempting itself from liability. So it probably would escape it. I think the newspapers are afraid of a libel suit, and I think that's probably one of the reasons they do it, and Zuckerberg's not afraid of that. But I think if we change that law, that might help some. But I really think the answer is simply, particularly when you've got massive communications coming in from China and Russia, for crying out loud. Where are patriots?
Well, there is a business interest in anonymous comments because it increases traffic, and traffic increases business. Give us your observation on that point.
Well, you can do all sorts of things to increase revenue. You can sell drugs. You can hire yourself out to kill people. You can do all sorts of things to increase revenue. But you ought to have some basic ground rules that are in the public interest, that allow the system to operate efficiently and effectively and democratically. And one of them is disclose who's talking, so we know who's talking. You want me to listen to you? You're going to force yourself upon me? I don't know who you are, especially when you have a world where the messages are all free and they're massive. This is a new world, Ralph, where the case for disclosure is greater than it's ever been in human history. We've never had a situation where right now one person can communicate with 1 billion people. That's the number of subscribers Facebook has. 1 billion people at practically no cost. And when you have a system like that, the First Amendment's going to be just drowned in bullshit. And by the way, that's what's happening. So many, I can't tell you how many of the postings I see just have nonsense, just complete, utter nonsense. It's not a question, and a lot of it's because they're not identifying themselves. And it's nonsense that's dangerous, because when the media is 90% nonsense, then what do you do? And it's becoming that way.
Well, you're a prominent professor of law. We're elected head of the National Association of Professors Specializing in Child Protection. You're a legendary author of books and articles. You were a former assistant DA. You have run arguably the most effective advocacy institute for children. Many bills have gone through the legislature in California because of you and your team. And you sent a letter to Mark Zuckerberg. Did he respond?
No, he didn't. It's ironic. His headquarters is here in California, right near Stanford, Menlo Park area. And I thought, he might respond. I am somewhat known here, and I thought he might respond, and he didn't. And his board of directors didn't respond. They're not responding at all. I don't know whether we have to picket them or what. Maybe that's what we have to do.
Well, let's see whether we can get our listeners to get him to respond. We're going to give Facebook's telephone numbers, their headquarters, the most specific ones we can give on the program. And we hope our listeners will call and say, why aren't you not responding to Professor Robert Felmus' letter? Where can they see this letter before they make the call, Bob?
Well, I guess I can post it. If that's desired, I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
I can post it on our website. It is. I can post it on our website, which is www.cpil.org.
You're one of the fastest talking people I've ever met. You want to do that slowly?
Yeah, it's CPIL, stands for Center for Public Interest Law. CPIL at sandiego.edu is the email address, and the website is cpil.org, www.cpil.org.
That's Center for Public Interest Law, CPIL.org.
Right.
All right, give us a hand, listeners. We'll bring Mark Zuckerberg to a little level of humility here. When do you think the government is going to label Facebook equivalent to state action so it can be sued under the civil rights laws?
Not soon. He is a monopoly, though. He does qualify as a monopoly because monopoly is generally defined as more than 50% of the market share of the relevant market. And he's got two competitors, I suppose, LinkedIn and MySpace. But he has 70 or 80% or 90% of the market. So he's a monopolist.
Well, you're an antitrust expert. You've written on it. Why isn't the Justice Department filing an antitrust suit? It seems to be a slam dunk lawsuit against a enormous share of the commercial market here.
Well, because monopoly is not unlawful. Monopolization is unlawful. If and when he uses unfair means to protect his monopoly, then it becomes a violation.
On that note, we have to close. Thank you very much, Professor Robert Falmouth, multiple author, advocate, children's advocate extraordinaire. To be continued, please, listeners, help Mr. Falmouth get a response, and I don't mean a form response from Mark Zuckerberg, who takes 20 minutes just to count how many billions of dollars he's worth.
Thanks, Ralph. I think you have very good issues here. And by the way, I named my oldest son after you. His middle name is Quixote.
Thank you, Bob.
We've been speaking with the founder of the Children's Advocacy Institute, Robert Falmouth. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Bill Hilsman and Robert Falmouth. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome Barbara Lewis to talk about child development. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And we're still waiting for the first organization of a Congress watchdog group. Let's hear from you, listeners.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up. We have a lot of good extras coming your way, starting off with a short exchange we had with Bill Hilsman about the Lincoln Project that came before we started recording the show.
The Lincoln Project ads, I don't think they're relevant. I mean, a lot of people in the press are talking about them, but if you look at the money, they're not really airing them to any degree that it would have an effect on voters.
No, mostly just DC, $5,000 on Fox News, hoping it'll leap into social media and get publicity.
Yeah, it's basically, they got a target audience of one, and they've sort of spread themselves so thin. Now they're, in one of the ads, they're attempting to play in some of the Senate races. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Their motives become fairly clear in the ads that have the request for donations on the end. I mean, they're spending like 15 seconds looking for donations.
It surprisingly have a little budget.
There's no way to find out the salaries they're making over at the Lincoln Project, right?
I don't think so. I mean, if anybody would know, Russell would know. Mocabber.
Yeah.
And now at the end of the interview, David gets to ask a question of Bill Hilsman.
On that note, to Steve, David, any input before we have to close?
Well, I wanted to ask you about advertising. Do we know for a fact that it actually works, or is it just a way to feather the nest of all these consultants? Generally speaking.
Well, that's been a bone of contention for a long, long time. And the only thing, you cannot prove a causation between advertising and a particular action. You can prove a lot of high correlation. So people have studied this for decades, the commercial marketplace, and the reason why companies basically advertise and people advertise their services is because of that correlation. Do I know for sure that because a certain person saw a certain ad, that person voted for a certain candidate? No. But when you look at it over a broader group of people and a broader range of time, there seems to be a fairly high correlation between more levels of advertising, more effective advertising, advertising that people can play back to you, that can describe what they saw, and buying actions or voting actions.
You know, our next guest taught us not to trust TV advertising. There was a period in the late 60s and the 70s where I would assume most Americans didn't trust what they saw on television. Are audiences more trusting of TV ads now?
No. I mean, the problem if you're an ad maker is that there is no more sophisticated person in the world in terms of defenses against advertising than an American consumer. I mean, they're experts. They watch hours upon hours upon hours of this.
But we don't have an FTC or an FCC anymore saying this is a lie. Geritol is not telling the truth about this product. They used to do that. We don't hear the FTC or the FCC cracking down on false advertising. So after a while, haven't the American people been acclimated to assume that everything they see on TV must be the truth? The ads must be true?
No, I think it's the exact opposite. I think the default position for almost any American that's viewing a TV ad is that this is not true. This is somebody trying to sell me something. So you really have to be artful in the way that you go about trying to persuade somebody to do something to get around those defenses. I mean, whether it's true or whether it's false, the default position for most viewers in the United States is if this is advertising, somebody's trying to sell me a bill of goods.
I can just hear some of our listeners saying, what's all this emphasis on advertising? Just get some grassroots community, get out the vote movements underway. Get people registered. Get people to the polls and transportation. Get them to overcome the various obstacles of photo ID weeks before the election. Get them to learn how to do mail-in ballots. That's the way to get people out to vote and get them informed in the vote. What do you say about that? And is there any linkage to ads and getting people actually out to vote?
One of the very first political campaigns we did was for Paul Wellstone. Paul Wellstone was a college professor at a small college in Minnesota. He decided to run for United States Senate. His name identification was not very high in the state of Minnesota. Nobody really knew anything about a small town college professor in Minnesota. He was an organizer. He was convinced he was going to win this campaign on the basis of people getting out there, registering voters, making his case directly to voters. When he came to my office to ask us to do advertising for him, I explained to him, Paul, you could spend the next 30 days, 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, 20 hours a day if you want, going every place in the state, spending all that time trying to educate people, organize people, persuade people, and I can put one ad of 30 seconds on the 10 o'clock news tonight in Minneapolis, and I will reach more people more times than you will be able to do it in a month of organizing. Wellstone won in one of the biggest upsets in American political history, and it had to do with the ads. It was the ads that won that race and made Paul a U.S. Senator. There was no other route to victory for an organizer like him in that situation.
But he did go all over Minnesota in a bus, so he did get himself a lot of personal exposure to get people to like him.
He did, and the reason why the bus became such a symbol of the campaign was because we put it in the ads.
Oh, there's the connection.
People went looking for the bus.
Tell me, on our last program afterwards, did you get any feedback from any of the Democratic Party apparatchiks, either in Minnesota or elsewhere?
No, but that's been going on, for decades.
And how would people reach you and get more information about your views on political advertising for the 2020 election?
Probably the best way to contact me is through Northwoods Advertising website, northwoodsadvertising.com, or you can always email the firm at info@northwoods, plural, advertising.com.
Well, we're going to send this interview to the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee and the Green Party and the Libertarian Party and anyone else who's interested, so we can get a healthy discussion about all this. Respect the voter, inform the voter, motivate the voter. Thank you very much, Bill Hilsman.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you for all the work you've done.
And now we continue our conversation with Robert Felmuth.
Let's open up another issue here that you have pioneered. The destructive use of fine print contracts by Facebook affecting 10 and 11-year-olds. You want to tell our listeners about that?
Well, we've been very concerned about the exploitation of children on Facebook in terms of products. And we have a bill actually in the state legislature right now addressing this, requiring that it involves, among other things, selling illicit goods to children, which Facebook facilitates in all sorts of ways. And, it's not proper to have the kid tell you the mother said it's okay, my mom says it's okay, or seals the credit card and so forth. There's got to be a reasonable mechanism to make sure that the parents are okaying something. And Facebook is now dealing with children at a massive level, at a massive scale. People I think are unaware of the extent to which children from the ages of 6 on up are on Facebook and use Facebook, not always identifying themselves as children, needless to say. So that's an important issue.
And these contracts, these children or their parents can't even read it. They just click on and they're obligated to adhere to these terms and conditions. And how one-sided are they?
Well, they're totally one-sided. I mean, there's no bargaining. The terms and conditions are simply an imposed, and if you're a monopoly, you're able to put pretty much anything you want in there.
Well, listen, I'll bet you Steve or David have used anonymous comments. Am I mistaken?
I think the Federalist Papers never would have been written if they couldn't be anonymous.
Publius. Were they truly anonymous, or did people know who they were?
They were truly anonymous.
No, they had pseudonyms, but people knew who they were. In those days, they used pseudonyms a lot, but it was the same pseudonym. So if it was Joe Schmo, they would say, "Oh, that's Madison."
I don't think Madison or Hamilton were afraid to speak out.
Yeah, I mean, just think of signing the Declaration of Independence anonymously, huh, David?
Yeah.
John Hancock signed it, and then everybody went, okay, I was going to make a joke.
Any additional comments?
Yeah, Bob, I just want to shift the discussion just slightly. You're a teacher, you're a professor, you teach at the law school level, but you also run a children's advocacy group. And now there's a huge controversy about sending kids back to school and the efficacy of remote learning. What is your take on all of this?
Well, I have a lot of take on it. I mean, I think, first of all, that it is good to have kids go to school. And it is good to have in-person teaching if possible. Of course, not at the cost of people's lives. The solution here is very simple, which is we had a decent president. He would simply use his emergency powers to increase testing to 1 billion. Here in San Diego, we have a La Jolla Country Day School, a private school, and some of our staff have children going there. They are tested. They're tested by a test that gets the results within 2 or 3 minutes. So it can be done. And in fact, there are new tests out right now, just in the past couple of weeks, that can be mass produced at that. So if you really want to solve this problem and protect people, if you can build 12 aircraft carriers at trillions of dollars, if you can build an F-15 fighter that nobody ever uses for anything for enormous amounts of money, you can afford to gear up the country. We're an amazing nation. We can do this and produce 1 billion tests. We can do this. This is the United States of America. We can do this. And then everybody can go to school safely, and we know who's sick and who's not. Bang, bang, bang. That's what you do. So
we just found out yesterday that Trump gets tested multiple times a day. I figure that's why he thinks there's too much testing. Half of it's for him.
He's probably irritated by it. But
yeah, they're sticking swabs up his nose every time he turns around.
We are using virtual teaching. I'm teaching via Zoom now, and I'm becoming more and more proficient in it. There is a case to be made for what's called hybrid teaching, where you have a small number of students spaced properly in the class with masks, and then you have some students on Zoom or whatever. And we're doing that here at USD starting in August. Some students are going to go to school one day, and then because we have, the same classroom size problem every school has, and then the next class, they will stay home and do Zoom. And so we have cut the class in half, but they still get live teaching. And the Zoom live teaching hybrid actually works pretty well. I mean, when I teach on Zoom, I'm looking at the students. If I have like 20 students, I'm looking at every one of their faces, and they're doing it from home. I mean, I have one student who's connecting to me lying in her bed, and she looks very comfortable. But it's you can make fun of them, and it's fun, And the virtual things they're able to do are amazing. One of the students is sitting on Waikiki Beach talking to me. He's not really, but I mean, he has a virtual background there. And then another student has the bar behind him. It's a bar with drinks on and everything. I asked him a question. He asked it right, and I said, "Okay, give me a bourbon for that." And everybody laughs. And we have breakout sessions where we can break out the class into 3 or 4 groups of 4 each and get a hypo and have them discuss a hypo and then come back to the class at large and discuss their points of view.
Hypo is hypothetical.
Yeah, and we have a Blackboard system, which everybody uses now, so I can get a document, a Word document or any document, or a video, and play it for the kids in the Zoom classroom. It's all virtual. I can see their faces. I can react. They can raise their hand. I can call on them. They can see my face. It does work. It's not like the unfortunate distance learning system that has evolved with the private colleges, which is exploitive and not effective and expensive and corrupt. It's a way where you can actually, if you're a good teacher, you can use these mechanisms. I still don't think they're quite as good as live teaching, but they can be made pretty close.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh yeah, David. I'm sorry. Dave did have a question.
David.
In light of defunding the police, Nader's Raiders came to prominence by attacking the Federal Trade Commission, that it wasn't doing its job, and it led to a more powerful Federal Trade Commission. How do you compare the Federal Trade Commission now to back when you guys started criticizing it? I believe it was like in 1970, 71. Was the Federal Trade Commission doing more or less back then than it is now?
Well, less. I mean, we did get the FTC Improvements Act enacted, which increases their powers fairly substantially, but it's still not enough. I mean, the most powerful unfair competition laws in the country are enforced by the U.S. attorneys, the federal statutes, antitrust and other statutes and fraud statutes, and by DAs, which I spent 9 years doing, and AGs. They're enforcing those kinds of laws in terms of unfair competition, deceptive advertising, and so forth. The Federal Trade Commission issues a cease and desist order, which does not yield civil penalties until it's violated. And since it takes 2 to 3 to 4 years to enter a cease and desist order, and that was our basic critique of it, and that still holds. That's still a problem. Now they've improved because they now can do a trade regulation rule where the violation of it will yield civil penalties immediately and so forth. But it's very different than my power under California law. When I was a prosecutor, I filed 22 antitrust cases and won all 22 of them, and I got judgments, and they pay attention to me. The industry pays attention, because I can go after them and bang civil penalties of $2,500 per violation. And a typical violation offense can involve a million violations, because it's every deceptive comment to every person who receives it. And that adds up enormously. And so we collect a huge amount of civil penalties, and guess what? They pay attention. And when we tell them to cut something out, they cut it out.
Are you saying that in order to enforce FTC regulations, the FTC needs the Justice Department?
The FTC needs to have the kind of powers that other prosecutors have, which means basically if you're deceptively advertising and injuring people, you have immediate penalties. You have immediate sanctions that are going to be imposed upon you. You're not going to get a free bite. We're not going to wait until after you violate a cease and desist order. We're not going to do that. And that's what has to happen.
In other words, once they violate the cease and desist, it's turned over to the Justice Department. Is that how it works?
No, the FTC does it. The FTC can go after civil penalties, and it has the power to do that. And it can also, because of our Improvements Act, go directly to court. It has more power. It can go directly to court. It can issue a cease and desist order that applies essentially through a trade regulation rule to a whole industry or whole branch. Those are major improvements. But it's still got the free step, free bite element to it, which has to stop. You need deterrence.
Because these corporate lawyers, David, can drag the FTC on forever. I mean, they
do.
specialize it. One of them bragged about being a born procrastinator.
Wasn't Christopher Cox, Richard Nixon's son-in-law? Didn't he write the report? Help
Ed
write
Cox.
the report?
Ed Cox.
Ed Cox. Yeah, Ed Cox. He was one of the three authors. Yes, he was a very good guy.
Too bad David held up on his joke, but now we're going to really wrap it up with Ralph answering more of your listener questions.
Let's do some listener questions. David, you want to do the honors?
This first one comes to us from Mark Hudgens. Ralph, your thoughts and memories on John Lewis, who passed away.
John Lewis practiced what he preached. He was a true American hero, and he was on the ramparts when very few were on the ramparts in the South during the civil rights struggles. When he came to the Congress, and he spent 17 two-year terms in the Congress from the Atlanta area, he was the moral conscience of the House of Representatives. He embarrassed a lot of the members when he would say, "What are you going to tell your children and grandchildren if you vote the cruel way?" I only wished he could have used his capital to broaden out his efforts. I don't think he would have spread himself too thin. But obviously, corporate exploitation of African Americans and other minorities could have been brought to a higher visibility in the indifferent House of Representatives had he chosen to do that. But how much can you expect of a heroic human being? If we had more people like John Lewis, we'd have more range of issues that would be brought under high moral compass.
Thanks, Ralph, for that. These next two questions are related because they relate to our call to action to call the White House switchboard from last week's program. The people, Patricia Cavicchione and Bob O'Brien, both called the numbers that we gave them, and they just said that one of the comment lines was closed, the 1111 number, 1414 number routed you to the whitehouse.gov contact sheet. And they both felt a little bit discouraged by the fact that they couldn't speak to anybody personally. One line was closed and the other one just transferred you to a contact sheet.
Not surprising in the Trump White House. This is a time when the comment numbers should be staffed by even more volunteers than have staffed it over the years. This is where you want more comment in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, not less. So it's an abrupt rupture of a traditional White House window for citizens to complain, to suggest, to advise, to object. Shame on Trump.
All right, this next question, I'll probably give the answer to this. It comes from Buck Allen, and it's called Toyota Fuel Pump Recall. He says, Mr. Nader, this NHTSA safety recall mandatory notice began in January. Fuel pump failure results in engine sputtering, making vehicle more difficult to control and increases collisions. He says, how does an individual disabled consumer help shine a light on this consumer financial cost and deadly risk to life and limb? And he should probably go to autosafety.org, right, Ralph?
That's right. The Center for Auto Safety in Washington, D.C., I'm sure is fully aware of this mandatory Toyota recall and could respond to your inquiries.
So that's at autosafety.org, Buck. Check that out. Dave, why don't you do the next one?
This is from Ruben Yancey. Great show. Would you consider a show focusing on Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi? Her treatment of Trump and her hesitation to actually assist the common folk is striking and frightening. I would like to understand what's going on. Thank you so much for your work.
Well, I'm sure Nancy Pelosi would not respond to an interview request. However, we may get some people who have knowledge of her record, her performance, her views, her opinions, how she handles the Democrats and Republicans in the House of Representatives. So stay tuned.
All right. Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome Barbara Lewis to talk about child development. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting ready.